On a brittle winter evening, Henry Walker was halfway through his usual crossword when the porch light began to tremble again. He set the pen down, listening to the small taps on the wooden steps outside. For years he had blamed it on the old house, on wind and loose boards. But tonight, when he eased the door open, a young bobcat cub sat squarely on his welcome mat, narrow chest rising in quick, careful breaths. It did not run. It only stared past him at the dim hallway, as if searching for someone who should have been there. Henry's hand tightened on the knob as a question he had avoided for months finally settled in his chest. Why had this wild little heart chosen his lonely door? The winter evenings had started coming earlier than my memory said they should. By 5 o'clock, Maple Ferry was already wrapped in blue shadow, and my little house at the edge of town floated alone in it. Most nights I sat in my worn chair by the front window, watching the porch light spill a pale circle onto the steps and the old railing. Lately, that light never seemed to stay still. On calm nights, the bulb should have burned steady, yet it kept giving the faintest tremor, as if something brushed it in passing. I'd look up from my crossword and catch the glass shade swaying just a hair. A slow, lazy swing that didn't match the quiet air. The shadows stretched and folded across the planks, long and thin, then gone before I could decide if they were real. The first sound came on a Tuesday, a small tap on the painted wood between one breath and the next. It was so soft I thought it might be my own pulse thumping in my ears. I held my breath, listening past the fridge hum and the old clock on the wall. Another tap, quick and light, like a pebble nudged by a gentle shoe. I set my mug down and stood, knees never happy about it anymore. The hallway floor protested with its usual creaks as I made my way to the door. When I opened it, the night air slipped in, sharp and dry, carrying the distant hiss of a passing truck on the highway. The porch sat empty, only a scatter of dry leaves piled against the step like small, defeated flags. Next morning, I noticed my right boot wasn't where I'd left it. It had been lined up neatly beside its partner under the bench, as it'd done for years. Now it stood turned sideways, a faint dusty smear across the toe, like something had brushed past it in the dark. My fingers tingled as I picked it up. Then I laughed out loud at myself and blamed the clumsiness on age. That night, the sound came again, a mix between a soft thud and a hollow click. My chest tightened in a way I hadn't felt since my wife passed. That old sense that the house was too big and my ears too full of quiet. I told myself it was just the wood contracting in the cold, or a loose board settling. The kinds of things old houses do to remind you they were here before you. Still, when I stood in the doorway, something in the air felt occupied. The porch light glowed against the thin crust of frost along the rail, and in its glow I thought I saw the faintest mark, a tiny pattern of dents in the white dust. They were small, almost delicate, forming two neat curves where nothing had been the day before. My breath slowed as I leaned closer, but the frost glittered back at me, giving no explanation. The following evening, I tried to ignore it. I left the television on with some game show I didn't care about, just so the voices would fill the living room. Yet each time the laugh tracks swelled, my attention slipped back to the front door. The skin along my forearms prickled as if a draft had found a gap. Though the windows were shut tight and the heater purred steadily. Another night. Another sound. This time it was a faint scrape, like something small adjusting its weight on painted wood. I froze halfway to the kitchen, heart knocking once. Hard. The porch light flickered again. Not a full blink, just a breath of dimness. I muttered that it was time to change the bulb, annoyed at myself for feeling watched in my own home. 2 mornings later, I found a thin strand of something pale and fine caught on the edge of the welcome mat. It clung there, curved and delicate, almost translucent in the slant of sunrise through the storm door. I picked it up between thumb and finger, feeling the ghost soft texture against my skin before it slipped away on a tiny breeze. I told myself it was a stray thread from my own scarf, though I knew every scarf I owned was dark. That afternoon, sitting by the window, I tried to list sensible explanations the way my late sister Claire would have made me do. Loose wiring, wildlife in the yard, my imagination getting pushy in retirement. Still, my gaze kept drifting to that circle of light outside, where the shadows sometimes seem thicker, as though something just out of sight was holding its breath along with me. The 5th night in a row that the tap came at nearly the same time, my hand tightened around the arm of my chair. The sound was familiar now, yet no less strange, like someone knocking softly but without their knuckles. The porch light trembled in answer, throwing a quick, narrow shape along the siding, gone before I could define it. I felt the hairs along the back of my neck stir, a quiet alarm my thoughts couldn't talk away. When I finally switched off the lamp and let the living room sink into shadow, the glow from outside became the only real light. It pulled on the rug near the door, stretching toward my shoes like a quiet invitation. For the first time since my wife's funeral, I caught myself whispering into an empty room, asking no one in particular who was there and why they kept choosing my porch. The silence that answered felt full, not hollow, and I knew something was repeating. Something or someone was visiting, whether I was ready to understand it or not. The next morning brought a pale, washed-out sun that didn't quite have the courage to warm anything. I shuffled to the front door with my coffee, the way I had for years, and unlatched the storm door to let in some crisp air. The porch boards were stiff with frost, every grain of wood picked out in silver. That was when I saw them, clearer than before. 4 tiny pairs of dents leading straight to my welcome mat. They were arranged in neat sets, shallow impressions in the white dust, no bigger than the tip of my thumb. Each cluster looked like a miniature pattern pressed by something precise, not the smudge of a boot or the drag of a branch. I blinked once, then twice, my breath making a small cloud that drifted over them. Probably a squirrel, I murmured, though I'd never seen a squirrel walk with such careful symmetry. As I bent closer, a faint sound came from beneath the porch, a quiet scuffle like soft pads brushing old boards. The noise rose, stilled, and then there was a whisper of movement along the far step. My heart gave a single heavy thud, reminding me I wasn't as young as the image in my head. I told myself not to be ridiculous, that small animals lived under houses all the time, and that I'd lived with worse noises when my kids were teenagers. I went about my morning tasks, yet my body refused to forget. The skin between my shoulder blades stayed tight, as if I were waiting for someone to speak my name. Every creak of the floor, every sigh of the heater seemed sharper. When a spoon clinked a little too loudly against the sink, I jumped and then laughed at myself, feeling my cheeks warm at how thin my nerves had become. Just before noon, a shadow slipped across the lower part of the front window. It was quick, small, and low to the ground, sliding past the frosted glass like a breath. I set my plate down and stepped closer, one hand resting against the cool pane. There was nothing but pale light, the empty porch, and the faint outline of those tracks still pressed into the fading frost. The oddest feeling washed over me, as if something had checked on me and moved along. That evening, I left the porch light off for the first time that week, curious what the dark would reveal. The yard spilled into a soft, grey-blue pool, the tree line at the back no more than a darker smudge. I stood just inside the storm door, feeling the cool seeping through the glass. Somewhere outside, a tiny sound, like a small body landing gently on wood, reached me, and I felt my pulse jump in my throat. Slowly, I flipped the porch light on. The bulb hummed, then poured its weak circle onto the steps. At the far corner of the light, near the edge where porch met yard, something small crouched. 2 pale points shone back at me, set in a narrow face turned just slightly away. The shape was low, compact, with a faint outline of a short tail and tufted ears catching the glow like little torn flags. We looked at each other for only a heartbeat. Then the small figure turned, muscles rolling in a smooth, wild line, and slipped off the porch with barely a sound. A faint whisper of claws clicked against the last board before silence swallowed it. I pressed my palm harder to the glass, feeling its cold bite into my skin, wondering if it'd truly seen what I thought I had, or if loneliness was starting to draw its own pictures. The next morning, the tracks were back, deeper this time and circling once around the mat. A few pale hairs clung to the corner of the step, hardly there at all, but too fine to belong to any neighbour's dog. My chest tightened as I pinched one between my fingers, feeling the almost weightless thread quiver before the wind stole it. The air tasted metallic, edged with that strange mix of worry and wonder. All day, my mind kept returning to those pale eyes catching the light. They hadn't looked frightened so much as measuring, as if deciding whether I was a threat or something else entirely. I found myself moving more quietly in my own house, listening for the slightest scratch or soft landing on the boards outside. More than once I shook my head, muttering that I was making stories up, that it was just some wild youngster passing through. That evening, I set a shallow ceramic bowl near the door, not quite on the mat, not quite off it. I told myself it was only in case some travelling creature needed water, the way Claire used to do behind her clinic. When I opened the door again before bed, the bowl had shifted half an inch, a faint wet ring on the wood beneath it, and one small print smudged at its edge. Whatever was visiting had paused long enough to touch what he'd left. As I locked up for the night, my hands lingered on the deadbolt. I could no longer pretend this was just the house settling or my imagination playing tricks. There was a small, deliberate visitor circling my porch. The question that settled into me, deep and insistent, wasn't just what it was, but why it had chosen my lonely little door, and who had guided its narrow pause to this particular patch of light. In the morning light, the small prints triggered an older, deeper memory, like a photograph sliding loose from a book. Claire had stood on this same porch years ago, one hand on her hip, the other balancing a crate that shifted with quiet, nervous movement. She had always brought her work home, her pockets full of stories about creatures most people only glimpsed at the edge of their headlights. Back then, I had watched her step out of a rusted pickup with a tired smile, worry lines softened by the sight of home. Shed set the crate gently on these same boards, speaking in a calm, low voice to the unseen occupant. It teased her for talking more kindly to wild things than she did to most neighbours, and Shed just shrugged, saying they needed it more. The memory left a warm ache in my chest. Claire had run a small rehabilitation room behind the old feed store, a place that smelled of hay, antiseptic, and stories. People brought her injured or orphaned animals, mostly the common kind, but sometimes something wilder would appear, wrapped in a borrowed towel and carried like fragile cargo. She never turned anyone away if she could help it, never once complaining about the late night calls. One autumn evening, long before my hair went white, a young woman had pulled up to the curb in a car that rattled like it was missing important parts. Shed stumbled out with a bundled jacket in her arms, eyes wide and scared. Inside the bundle, two narrow faces had peeked out, ears too pointed and eyes too old for the bodies that held them. They were small, wild youngsters, their spots still fading, their breath shallow with worry. Claire had met them with that steady calm of hers, hands sure but gentle. Shed shown me the small marks on their fur, the burrs stuck in their coats, the way they tried to act fierce while trembling. Wed spent that night in the back room. The three of us gathered around a low crate while rain ticked against the metal roof. The little ones had watched us with unblinking attention, learning our shapes and the patterns of our voices. For weeks, Claire balanced her time between the clinic and this house, splitting her days into careful routines. She rose before dawn to feed the fragile pair, whispering to them as she changed bandages and checked tiny paws. Her coffee went cold most mornings, forgotten beside the crate while those keen eyes followed her every move. I'd stand by the door, feeling oddly honoured to be allowed into their circle. When the time came to move them to a larger enclosure on the wooded edge of town, it was Claire who insisted they feel the rough boards beneath their feet first. She brought them here, one at a time, carrying each against her chest like a secret. On this porch, she let them test their weight, their new strength, their curiosity about the wide, confusing world. The planks had shivered under their first confident steps. Eventually, they were released along the tree line near the creek, far from traffic and curfews. Claire watched from a distance, binoculars tucked against her eyes, until they slipped into the underbrush and did not turn back. On the drive home, quiet settled over her, thick and thoughtful. "I always wonder if they remember," Shed said, fingers resting on the steering wheel like she was afraid to grip too hard. Over the years, people in town kept sending her small lives that needed a hand. Some stayed only days, others weeks, a few months. Shed scribble notes in a spiral notebook, recording dates, weight, and little observations about quirks and habit. More than once, she mentioned that certain personalities returned, echoes of past visitors showing up in new faces. I had smiled and told her she was imagining patterns, but secretly I believed her. When her health began to fail, her world shrank to shorter walks between the porch, the kitchen, and that back room where she kept her charts. She kept the porch light burning no matter how high the electric bill climbed, saying it helped travellers find the right door. I had thought she meant people, those who needed medicine or advice. It occurred to me now that maybe shed meant something else as well. After Claire died, I closed up the clinic room and told myself that part of life was over. I kept the house and moved into it, partly to be near her memories, partly because the town felt less empty from here. The notebook stayed on a shelf in the hallway, its edges soft from use. I had not looked inside for a long time. The words had felt too close to her voice. Standing at the window now, watching the faint prints melt into the porch boards, I realized how easily it assumed my quiet days were entirely my own. Yet Claire had spent years teaching this place to be a kind of harbour, a small, dependable light in a dark patch of map. It made sense that something in the world might still be following paths Shed once drawn, even if the one waiting behind the door these days was no longer my sister, but an old man with more questions than answers. That realization pressed a new weight into my chest, a mixture of guilt and wonder. Trust, I knew from watching Claire, was something wild creatures paid for in careful installments. And if one had begun to circle this porch again, leaving careful tracks at my feet, there was probably a reason it struggled as much with trust as I did with the loneliness that met me in every room. The next evening, I prepared without admitting I was preparing. I straightened the small rug by the door, wiped the frost dust from the threshold, and set the ceramic bowl out again, this time with fresh water and a modest offering of cooked chicken. I told myself it was simply kindness toward any passing creature, but my hands moved with a deliberate care that betrayed a deeper hope. I turned off the television earlier than usual so the house could breathe in quiet. Outside, the wind had dropped, leaving the night still enough that I could hear the distant hum of the highway and the occasional clink of a neighbour's wind chime. My breathing sounded too loud in the dim living room. I stood just to the side of the window, the porch in clear view, my fingers resting lightly on the curtain edge. It didn't take long. A soft thump touched the boards, lighter than a boot, heavier than a falling leaf. My chest tightened as a small shape slipped into the arc of the porch light. There, near the step where the prints had collected, stood a young, wild body on slender legs, spots faint along its flanks like ghosts not yet ready to leave. Tufted ears twitched at every distant sound. The little one moved with careful purpose, shoulders rolling in a way that suggested both grace and exhaustion. It approached the bowl in short advances, pausing between each as if expecting the world to change. The short tail flicked once, twice, a stuttering banner of uncertainty. I realized it'd been holding my breath and let it out slowly, fogging the glass in front of me. For a moment, its narrow head lifted, and those pale eyes swept the front of the house. They passed over the window where I stood, then slipped back, almost as if it knew I was there, but chose not to be startled by it. It lowered its muzzle to the water, lapping with quick, efficient movement. The sound reached me as a faint, rhythmic clicking, like raindrops tapping a metal pan. I watched the rise and fall of its small ribs, the way it shifted its weight from one paw to another, alert even in thirst. The meat in the dish sat untouched at first, too suspicious an offering to accept. Finally, after several long minutes, it leaned forward and took a small piece, chewing slowly, as if prepared to flee even while it swallowed. The tension in my shoulders softened with each careful bite. A strange warmth spread through me, starting somewhere behind my ribs. This porch had seen all manner of visitors over the years, but witnessing such wariness mixed with need made something old in me stir. It felt like the first time my grandchild had taken my hand without being prompted. A quiet, tentative bridge between worlds. I realized I was smiling, though my eyes stung. The young visitor finished its small meal and sat back on its haunches, tail curling around its feet. Its gaze lifted again to the door, lingering longer this time. It seemed to listen, as if expecting another voice to speak from inside, one more familiar than mine. The realization pricked at me. Perhaps it had known this porch under different circumstances, under Claire's gentle tones and sure hands. I stepped away from the window and moved toward the front door, heart thumping louder than any creak in the floor. My hand hovered over the knob. I knew sudden movement might undo all the quiet work of the last few visits. Instead of flinging the door wide, I eased it open just a sliver, enough for my voice and a thin line of warm air to slip out. "Easy now," I said softly, the words catching slightly on the cool night. My tone surprised me. It sounded like Claire's on those long ago evenings, patient and without demand. The form on the porch stiffened, ears pointing toward the sound. It did not bolt. Instead, it eased backward a step, then another, paws placing themselves with deliberate care. We stood in that fragile balance for several heartbeats, my hand on the knob, its body angled away, but not in flight. Finally, it turned, hopped down from the porch with a light clack of claws, and moved toward the tree line, pausing once to glance back over its shoulder. The look was quick but unmistakable, as if it were memorizing the door as much as I was memorizing it. When the little one vanished into the darker band of yard, I closed the door gently. My chest felt simultaneously heavier and lighter, crowded with questions, but buoyed by that single choice it had made not to run in blind panic. For the first time since the visits began, I understood that this was no random passerby. A connection, however fragile, had been offered, and I would have to decide what to do with it. A week later, the kitchen table disappeared under papers. The real estate brochure sat on top, its glossy pictures of the house making it look cleaner and warmer than my dust cloth could ever manage. I'd told myself for months that it was time to sell, to move into something smaller, maybe closer to town, closer to people, a place without the constant echo of Claire's footsteps in my memory. Yet every time I picked up the brochure, my eyes drifted to the window that faced the porch. The small visitor had become a near nightly presence now, arriving sometime between the 6 o'clock news and the weather report. Its visits were still cautious, its movements sharp with alertness, but it stayed longer, drinking and eating and occasionally sitting in that thoughtful way that made it look decades older than it was. One evening, as I sat at the table pretending to read the listing, a faint, familiar sound rose from the porch. The rhythmic clack of small teeth worrying a hard edge. My hands stilled on the paper. I walked to the window and saw the young wild body crouched by the post, jaw working on a dry stick it had dragged up from the yard. It chewed and then dropped the stick, eyes drifting toward the door as if waiting for someone to appear. I had the strangest feeling that it was expecting Claire. Perhaps some old memory lingered in its blood. Or perhaps it was kin to one shed once helped. Either way, the small forehead furrowed in a way that looked almost puzzled. My own chest mirrored that tension. I pressed my fingertips to the cold glass, acutely aware that if I left, if the house sold, that expectant gaze would meet only an empty porch. The next day, I spread my bills and bank statements out beside the real estate folder, trying to be practical. The numbers said it'd be more comfortable in a smaller place, one without a drafty back room that no longer had a purpose. Still, each time the furnace kicked on and air moved through the vents, I felt a presence at the edge of hearing, as if the house itself were listening to my calculations. That evening, the visitor arrived earlier than usual, just as the light was turning that particular shade of gold that makes everything look briefly forgiven. It paced the porch, more restless than it'd seen before, circling the bowl and glancing at the door repeatedly. Its tail flicked and then stilled, the short tip giving a frustrated twitch. I could feel that agitation in my own muscles, a shared unease I hadn't asked for but couldn't refuse. When I stepped onto the porch with a small plate of food, the little one froze, body lowering but not fleeing. I set the plate near the usual spot and eased myself down onto the top step, letting the cool wood press against the back of my leg. The air smelled of damp leaves and something sharper, like distant smoke. My heartbeat seemed to echo in my ears. The youngster moved cautiously toward the plate, eyes never leaving me completely. Every few bites, it paused to glance at the real estate brochure I held folded in my hand, though of course it couldn't know what the paper meant. Still, the sight of those wild eyes resting briefly on the pamphlet made something inside me lurch. It was as if the decision had grown a face, narrow and spotted and unwilling to look away. I thought of the people who might buy this place. A young family wanting more room. Someone from the city seeking quiet. A developer who saw only land and not the stories stitched into it. Would they tolerate a wild youngster on their porch, asking silent questions with its patient visits? Or would they call someone to trap it, to remove the inconvenience from their neatly planned lives? The thought tightened my throat, as if sensing my turmoil. The little one suddenly stepped closer, closing the gap between us by a single cautious stride. It stopped just out of arm's reach, eyes level with my knees, head tilted slightly. For a heartbeat, I felt the urge to reach out, to brush my fingers along its cheek the way I had with Claire's former charges. Instead, I let my hands stay where they were, palms open on my thighs. The brochures and bank statements weighed on the table behind me like a second, unseen presence. I felt caught between the need for practical security and a pull I couldn't name. Something that smelled faintly of antiseptic and hay and Claire's old hand lotion. The little one's gaze held mine steadily, unblinking, carrying a question I could no longer pretend not to hear. That night, sleep came in thin, restless strips. Each time I drifted off, I saw the porch empty and quiet, the bowl gone, the light off, and the young wild body arriving to find only cold boards and a locked door that no longer belonged to me. When I woke before dawn, the decision that had hovered for months sat on my chest like a weight. I could no longer ignore that walking away from this place meant walking away from more than dusty rooms. It meant breaking a fragile trust that was only now beginning to form. Morning brought a dull, pewter sky and a stiffness in my joints that matched the day's colour. I shuffled down the hallway toward the kitchen, but my steps slowed near the door to the back room, the one that had once been Claire's sanctuary. Dust had gathered along the baseboard, and a thin spider web wavered between the doorknob and the frame like a half-hearted attempt at keeping things closed. On impulse, I reached out and brushed it away. The room breathed out a faint mix of old paper, disinfectant, and time. Light from the small window fell across the work table where Claire had kept her charts, painting a pale rectangle on the scarred surface. On the shelf, the spiral notebook leaned against a stack of worn reference books, its cardboard cover softened to a gentle curve. I felt my throat tighten as I stepped inside, feet careful on the familiar floor. I picked up the notebook with both hands, as if it might break from the years between us. The first pages held neat records, lines of dates and weights and brief observations in Claire's sharp handwriting. Good appetite today. Still wary of sudden movement. Seems drawn to porch light after dusk. I turned the pages slowly, tracing the lives of creatures who had come and gone under her care. Near the middle, a loose sheet of paper slipped free and fluttered to the floor. I bent with a soft groan to pick it up. The note was written in the same firm script, but lacked the clinical form of the other entries. If I'm gone before the wild ones stop coming. It began, please leave the porch light on. They don't know about hospitals and retirement plans. They only know that some doors have been kind. My vision blurred as I read. If anyone finds a youngster and doesn't know where else to go. The note continued. I've told them this address. The world closes doors on wild lives so easily. Maybe this one can stay cracked open a while longer, even if it's just my brother making tea in the kitchen. She had underlined brother twice, the ink pressing deeply into the paper. A faint sound reached me then, distant but clear. The soft clack of small claws on wood above the basement stairs. The visitor had arrived early again. I stood there in the back room, the note trembling slightly in my hand, as the realization settled over me like a wool blanket. The youngster on my porch wasn't just any wanderer. It was someone's plea made flesh, a message from whoever had carried it here, trusting Claire's old promise. I found my way back to the living room with the note and the notebook held against my chest. At the window, the scene outside unfolded like a careful echo from the past. The young wild one stood by the bowl, tail curled around its feet, eyes lifted not toward the road but toward the door itself. It shifted its weight, uneasy, as if waiting for a familiar voice that did not come, taking a breath that felt too big for my aging lungs. I opened the front door and stepped onto the porch. The chill hit my face, bringing tears to the corners of my eyes that had nothing to do with the wind. The little one froze, muscles coiled, but it did not bolt. Instead, it lowered itself slightly, as if trying to make its small form less threatening, a gesture of trust that pierced me clean through. I'm not her, I said softly, my voice rough with emotion. But I'm here. The words surprised me. I hadn't known I would say them until they were already in the air between us. The youngster's ears twitched toward my voice. It took a cautious step forward, nose lifting to test the scents that clung to me. Coffee, old wool, and the faint ghost of Claire's hand lotion still lingering on the doorknob. At the edge of the porch, a folded piece of paper caught my eye, weighted down by a small stone. I hadn't noticed it before. Knees protesting. I bent to pick it up. The handwriting on the outside was unfamiliar but steady. For whoever still keeps this light on. It read. My fingers shook as I unfolded it. Inside, a short message sprawled across the page. Claire helped my father years ago. It said, when he found a wild youngster caught in a fence, she took it in. No questions asked. He kept her address in his wallet until he died. When I found this little one by the roadside, I remembered the card and brought it here. I hope this door is still kind. I can't keep it. My lungs won't let me, and my landlord says no. Please forgive me for leaving it. The street names, the dates, the closing scrawl, everything on the note wove together in a quiet tapestry of need and hope. The visitor at my feet shifted closer, as if sensing that something important had passed between the humans it could not fully understand. My chest ached with a tender, painful weight. The reason this small wild heart stood on my porch was not random. It was the echo of my sister's kindness, returning years after she'd gone. I sank carefully onto the step, the boards creaking beneath me. The youngster approached until only an arm's length separated us. Nose working, whiskers trembling in the cold air. Slowly, giving it every chance to refuse. I extended my hand, palm open. It hesitated, then leaned in and touched the back of my fingers with a quick, cautious press of its nose. A shiver went through me, not from the cold, but from the quiet rush of understanding. In that simple contact, the threads of past and present tugged tight. This place, this porch, was never meant to be just my retirement refuge. It was part of a promise Claire had made to the world, and that nameless stranger had trusted that promise enough to leave something precious at my door. The knowledge broke my heart open in a way that felt both painful and right, as if some stiff hinge in my chest had finally loosened. After that morning, the house felt different. Not louder, exactly, but more awake. I called the youngster Pine, for the tall trees that framed the back of the property and the resin scent that sometimes clung to its fur. The name was for my sake more than for its. It moved to its own wild rhythms, but having something to call it softened the space between us. Each evening, as the light thinned, Pine's narrow form would appear at the edge of the yard. I adjusted my days without quite admitting I was doing so. Groceries were bought earlier. Phone calls finished before dusk, so that I could be home when the familiar thump of small paws touched the porch. We settled into a routine of shared silence. Pine eating from the bowl, me sitting nearby on the steps with a mug of tea warming my hands. The porch light cast us both in the same soft glow, our breaths making small clouds in the cool air. Neighbours began to notice. Old Mr. Grady from across the street would sometimes pause on his evening walk, leaning on his cane, eyes narrowing at the sight of the spotted youngster on my porch. You always were Claire's brother, he'd say with a half smile, tipping his cap. He'd shrug, but inside I felt oddly proud, as if I were finally stepping into a role he'd been avoiding. The seasons shifted with their own slow insistence. frost gave way to damp mornings, then to warm nights where the porch boards held the heat long after sunset. On rainy days, pine appeared soaked and spiky, shaking droplets from its coat before stepping under the small overhang near the door. It'd lay out an old towel a short distance away, and though it never lay down on it, the little one would sit close enough that a few scattered drops darkened the fabric. Inside, the back room came alive again. I cleared the old work table, wiped away dust, and placed Claire's notebook in the centre, open to a fresh page. My handwriting was clumsier than hers, but I did my best to keep notes all the same. Pine arrived earlier tonight. He'd write. Seemed restless until I sat on the step. Calmed once I spoke. Still wary of sudden sounds, but lingering longer. The act of recording felt like a small conversation with my sister. Some afternoons, it'd sit by the front window with a book and catch Pine watching from the shade of the pines. Eyes half-lidded, body stretched out but ready. We existed in parallel lines, close but not tangled, each aware of the other's presence. The sound of Pine's light steps on the gravel had become as familiar to me as the mail truck's squeak or the distant laughter from the diner down the road. On weekends, my daughter would visit with her family. I kept Pine's existence mostly to myself, not wanting a flurry of attention to disrupt the careful trust we'd built. Still, my granddaughter once pointed to the faded prints near the steps and asked what made them. I told her it was a shy neighbour who preferred the night and liked its privacy. She nodded solemnly, as if understanding better than I did. One quiet evening, as cicadas hummed in the trees, Pine did something new. After finishing its meal, it padded up the steps with confident, measured strides and settled on the board beside me, close enough that the warmth of its body reached my calf. It curled its short tail around its paws and stared out at the darkened yard as if we were two old men on a bench, sharing the view. I did not move, barely dared to breathe. Time stretched in that shared stillness. The porch light buzzed faintly, moths occasionally tapping the glass shade with soft wings. The smells of cut grass and distant fried food from the diner drifted past. Pine's ears swiveled slowly, tracking sounds I could barely hear, but its body remained relaxed, as if the step beneath us had finally earned a measure of safety. When Pine eventually rose and slipped away into the night, I stayed seated, my knee tingling where its flank had brushed me. The porch, once an empty stage where the echoes of loss played on repeat, now felt like a small, sturdy bridge between the life it'd known and the one I was learning to inhabit. The decision about selling the house, once so loud, had grown quiet without my noticing. The for sale folder lay unopened on the sideboard, gathering dust instead of signatures. Days turned into weeks. weeks into months. We marked the passage of time, not with holidays or big milestones, but with small, shared rituals. The sound of Pine's pause on the steps at dusk. The way it would glance at the front door before settling by the bowl. My habit of touching the porch railing with 2 fingers whenever I stepped outside. A wordless greeting to whatever might be watching from the tree line. The house no longer felt too big. It felt exactly the size it needed to be. The next winter arrived with softer edges than the last. Maybe it was the way it learned to move through the house, more aware of its size and groans, less startled by its lonely noises. Maybe it was the presence that came and went at my door, leaving a pattern of prints on the frosted boards that no longer felt mysterious, only reassuring. The cold, still bit, but it did not feel empty. One especially clear evening, the stars pricked the sky like small, stubborn lanterns. I sat on the porch step with a blanket over my knees, a mug cooling beside me. Pine emerged from the shadows between the pines, coat thicker now, muscles more defined. It moved with the easy confidence of someone who knew every creak, every nail, every scent layered on this small patch of world. Pine hopped onto the porch without hesitation and settled in its usual place beside me. Its flank brushed my leg briefly before it curled into a loose, comfortable shape, eyes half closed, ears still alert. I reached down and let my fingers rest lightly on the board near its paws. Close but not quite touching, letting the warmth between us speak louder than any contact would have. Inside, Claire's notebook lay open on the table, a pen resting across the latest entry. My scrawl from earlier in the day read, "Pine seems at home here now." Perhaps that's enough of a legacy for one porch light. Writing the words had made my throat tighten. But now, feeling the gentle weight of Pine's presence beside me, the line felt right. This house had become what Claire had hoped, a door that stayed cracked open. I thought about the stranger's note, still tucked safely in the back room. Somewhere out there, a person with tired lungs and a strict landlord had made a hard choice, trusting a memory and a faded address. Their quiet courage and my sister's old promise had crossed years to land on these boards. The thought filled me with a soft, humbling gratitude that settled low and steady in my chest. Pine shifted, pressing its shoulder a fraction of an inch closer to my leg. The contact was brief, but it carried a kind of acceptance that words would only clumsily describe. I let myself lean into it just enough to feel the firmness of muscle beneath the thick winter coat. The porch light hummed above us, casting our shared shadow onto the steps, long and slightly blurred. From down the street came the sound of a car door closing and Mr. Grady's slow footsteps on the sidewalk. He lifted a hand as he passed, eyes flicking from me to Pine and back again. "Evening." he called softly, respect in his tone. Looks like you've got company. I smiled and nodded, feeling no need to explain. The story written on this porch belonged to those who stood upon it. As the night deepened, our breaths formed twin clouds in the cold air. I found myself speaking quietly, not to fill the silence, but to honour it. I told Pine about Claire, about her stubborn kindness and her belief that every small life deserved a safe landing. I spoke of the years when this porch had stood empty at dusk, and how strange it felt now to imagine it that way again. Pine's ear twitched occasionally, as if catching the rhythm, if not the meaning. When I finally fell quiet, a gentle calm settled over us both. The decision about the house no longer felt like a question. The brochures had gone into the bottom drawer weeks ago, replaced on the table by grocery lists and scraps of paper with hastily recorded observations about Pine's habits. My future, it seemed, was not in a smaller, tidier apartment, but right here, under this humming light, with this wild neighbour who had decided to stay. A breeze swept across the yard, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and distant fried onions from the diner downtown. Pine lifted its head, tasted the air, then lowered it again, apparently satisfied that nothing required its attention. I felt the same sense of gentle sufficiency. There would still be empty days and creaky joints and bills to pay, but there would also be evenings like this, shared without fanfare. Eventually, Pine rose and stepped down from the porch, moving into the darkness with that same smooth, confident grace. At the edge of the yard, it paused and looked back, eyes catching the warm light for a heartbeat. I lifted my hand in a small, instinctive gesture, more habit now than hope. Then it slipped into the shadows, leaving its familiar trail of prints pressed into the thin frost. I stayed on the step a while longer, letting the cold sink into my bones and the comfort settle just as deeply. Behind me, the house waited, not as a museum of loss, but as a place still in use, still needed. I thought of Claire, of the stranger, of Pine, and of how a single porch light, left burning out of stubborn habit, had woven us all together. When I finally stood, knees complaining as always, I didn't turn the light off. I left it glowing over the empty boards and the small, fading tracks. Somewhere out there, other lives might still be moving through the dark, following old promises and half-remembered kindness. If they ever needed a door that would open, they'd find this one. And inside, an old man who had found a new rhythm would be waiting, grateful that a small wild heart had once been left at his door. If this story touched your heart, drop a simple 1 in the comments to let us know you were here. Your support keeps these gentle stories alive. Don't forget to subscribe and stay with us, because the next story might just be the one that finds you when you least expect it.